All right, welcome back. Let's finish this up as quickly as we can, shall we? So, I spoke a little bit about the limiting factors on democratization and how things that occur in civil society can affect politics in terms of public health, in terms of literacy issues. And now I want to talk a little bit about religion. So, Nigeria tends to be a deeply religious state. The population tends to be deeply religious. Most people report that they attend some sort of services or community of faith. And about 40% of the overall population identifies as Christian of various types, about 40% as Muslims, again, various types, and about 10% list their primary religious practice as being a traditional indigenous practice such as ancestor veneration or Yoruba spiritual practices or various other animistic or shamanistic beliefs. Now, Christianity in Nigeria is pretty complex. Most of the population is Protestant, meaning not Roman Catholic, but it kind of splits in terms of how we think of it. I'm not saying most people here in the United States, particularly in the South, when I say Protestant, you think Baptist or Methodist. No. For the most part, we're talking about populations that are Anglican, Church of England. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, with British imperialism? But you also have various evangelical denominations, particularly Pentecostalism, Jehovah's Witnesses. About 25% of Christians identify as Catholic, but it's a minority group in terms of like about 75% are Protestant, only about 25% are Catholic. Now, in terms of Islam, Nigeria has the largest sub-Saharan Muslim population. It has more Muslims than Kenya, more Muslims than Niger, depending on how we're going. And most of the population is Sunni. Now, that's not surprising. Most of the North African populations that made it across the Trans-Saharan Trade Network back in the 9th and 10th century, most of them were Sunni. Thus, the first version of Islam that most people in this region came in contact with was Sunni Islam. But there are a number of different branches within Sunni. It's like saying, you're Protestant means not a whole lot. You kind of want further clarification on that. So there are a whole bunch of different denominations within Sunni practice. And there is some influence up in the north of Sufi brotherhoods. Sufis are kind of a 13th century mystic. I'm trying to think how I would describe this. There's a lot of emphasis on meditative dance and poetry and ecstatic writing as part of prayer. For Sufis, it tends to be much more evangelical and much more individualistic in terms of its practice. Sufism is a very small percentage of Nigerian Muslims. And then, like I said, you have indigenous beliefs. Most of them are found in the southwest of the country, largely among the Yoruba populations. If you didn't get a chance, go back and watch on, if you go back and you look at the political history sway that we did in class before the world went up in flames, if you go back and you look at that, there's an embedded crash course mythology video, and it talks about the Yoruba pantheon and kind of like Yoruba beliefs. It's really fascinating stuff. And if you watch it, then you should read the book Children of Blood and Bone, which is a wonderful young adult novel, and it kind of plays off of the Yoruba pantheon, and I totally recommend it. It's so good. Now, part of the reason why thinking about religion and access to education and public health is so important is because Nigeria has severe civil fractures. It has really big problems with social cleavages. There's a lot of difficulty all throughout Nigerian political history of kind of pushing the state above and beyond regional, ethnic, and religious divisions. The civil society thus far has not been particularly successful in kind of bridging that gap. There are so many rifts in society, and they have shown themselves in violent ways in the past. The two most fractured regions of the country are the North and the Niger Delta. Prior to about 2009, if we were going to talk about places that were unsettled in Nigeria, you'd talk about the Niger Delta. Now, part of the reason why the Niger Delta is so unsettled is because that is where the oil is. The oil is in the Niger Delta, and thus you have a lot of competition. So one of the first major movements to try and establish a sense of sort of like political separation after the Biafran crisis was the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people. Now, the Ogoni people are an ethno-linguistic group in the Niger region. They had been particularly targeted and negatively affected by Shell, the oil companies, oil and refining business. And so a fellow from this region by the name of Ken Saro-Wiwa. He was extremely critical of the practices of Shell in terms of their oil extraction, the environmental degradation, what it was doing to the Ogoni people's way of life. And so he forms this, hang on a moment. Okay. All right, we're all good. Okay, my apologies. He forms this organization to really kind of criticize Shell and to organize against it. This made him very, very unpopular, and this unfortunately ultimately results in his execution by the state. Now, the MOSOP, the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, was broadly nonviolent, but some of these civil society organizations that develop in opposition to kind of the extraction of oil or the exploitation of the people in this area have resulted in violence. In particular, you have the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, MEND. This tends to be a secessionist movement, and they've used everything from kidnapping to oil bunkering, which is where you tap the oil pipeline illegally and then create your own illegal refineries. That can be really dangerous because essentially you're causing deliberate oil spills all throughout a delta region with estuaries and swamps. And if you know anything from apes, you should know how critical wetland environments like that are to sort of the purification of water, and these areas just become totally toxic. So other aspects of civil society and civil fractures here, we talked about the Niger Delta being an area of great fracture, but up in the north now we really have to talk about Boko Haram. So Boko Haram is just kind of this growing expression of tension between Muslim and Christian populations. It's not like prior to 2009 there weren't tensions between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria. There obviously were. But essentially what occurs is in 2002 you've got a splinter group from a fairly fundamentalist branch of Islam up in the north that had felt that they were being targeted too much by evangelical Christians and missionary work. They felt that the state was infringing too much on their practice. And so they kind of like declared that they were going to break away from the state and do their own thing. The Nigerian military therefore cracked down on them in 2009 by killing their leader. When they killed their leader, Boko Haram radicalized. As soon as the leader was dead, a new leader rose in his place, and this one tended to be much more militant. And at this point, Boko Haram decides they're not just going to hang back and kind of like isolate themselves from the world. No, they're going to take their ideology and spread it. And that means that they push for a much wider application of Sharia all across the north, and they become increasingly critical of westernized processes, including education. Since 2009, Boko Haram has engaged in bombings and shootings. They've attacked into Christian religious services, and they've participated in a number of kidnappings. Most spectacularly, there was a case where they attacked into a girls' boarding school and kidnapped the girls there. As a result of all of this violence in the north, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 people have died. The numbers are really poor on this. It's hard for us to get an accurate count. And there's a strong suggestion that a lot of the funding that is used to carry out these acts is coming from outside. It's coming from Al-Qaeda, especially in Yemen, that you're seeing a number of other Sunni fundamentalist extremist groups funding into these groups. But one thing I do want to make very clear is that most of the victims of Boko Haram's actions have been Muslims. Most of the victims of Boko Haram's actions have been Muslims. They've been the neighbors of people in Boko Haram. They've been people who objected very strongly to the presence of Boko Haram in their own territory and were punished for it. While Christians have definitely been targeted, Muslims in the north of Nigeria have definitely paid a far higher price in terms of the direct consequences of violence. So that's where we're going to end for the day. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much today, but do me a favor. I want you to read carefully your Harkness readings. Tomorrow, you're going to use Flipgrid and you're going to respond to some questions and to some comments from your classmates. So I will see you tomorrow. Don't forget to log on to office hours today at 10:30 until noon if you need to ask me any questions. See you later, guys.